Hey there, Jim Johnson for Accent Help, and I'm continuing my rant on diacritics because somebody asked, so you all have to suffer because one person asked. So this is actually basically part 4, where I want to talk about the diacritics that I will tend to use to describe elements of accents with regards to consonants. So last time I talked about vowels. So here with consonants, the ones that I tend to use, one of them that I find very useful is about devoicing, where you're taking away the voicing of a sound. So, for example, it's super duper common for people with a Z at the end of a word to devoice it. Those. Now I know those is spelled with an S, but the sound is a Z. Those. If I made it fully an S, those. Those. What the S tends to do is it shortens the vowel sound before it. So the diphthong before it gets shortened. Those, those, those. So you'll hear it in a lot of accents. So this is sort of halfway between a Z and an S. It's in that land in between. There's also a diacritic that I don't tend to use, which is voiced. I'll talk about that one in a second here too. Which you could, these are potentially equal to one another. I would say, what is it more like? Is it more like an S? Well, then use an S that's slightly voiced. Or is the nature of that sound typically an S, but it seems to be getting voiced? So like some people don't say sink in some accents, like Baltimore, or somebody recently told me about, I'm trying to remember where that was, somebody from the South who tended to do that in their speech, zinc. There at the kitchen sink, zinc. Arguably, that person's saying there at the kitchen zinc. It's not quite zinc, but it's kind of in that land in between. So you might use that symbol there. I don't tend to use it so much. I tend to use this devoicing one. The other spot I'll use devoicing is primarily when I'm teaching about like elevated genericans, sort of neutral American speech. And this is because in the middle of a word, or even between words, Americans commonly say, Betty bought some butter. And I like to represent that D-like T sound, Betty, as a tapped R, because I think it's very much like the Spanish as in pero, meaning but, pero, as opposed to the trilled perro, meaning dog, perro, pero, Betty. I think it's that same thing. So I like to use the tap or flap R to express that. And then when you're doing RP, instead of going like classic RP, instead of going all the way to a T, Betty boughta. I hate that drill that teachers do with students that's Betty bought some butter, because now you don't sound human. I would rather that you start to work on a devoiced, an unvoiced tapped R. Betty bought some butter. So that lightness there, it's like a super light T. I have seen some transcriptions, like in some pronouncing dictionaries, where they like to explain that sound as a voiced, remember this one from what I put under the S, as a voiced T, Betty Botter, but then that doesn't give us the tweak room for devoicing it gently. Arguably, you just take away the aspiration, which I talked about previously, and then that's what turns it into an equivalent of a voiceless tapped R. I know I'm diving through this really fast, and if you're overwhelmed, that's okay. Remember, the IPA is a tool that you can use in different ways. Okay, some other ones that I really like to use with consonants, I will commonly use, in fact, a lot of people will use it with the L, and this is commonly considered the dark L as opposed to the light L. At the beginning of a word, most people do a slightly lighter L, and at the end of the word, people tend to do an L that's commonly called a darker L. It's more pulled back. This wavy line means velarized or pharyngealized, which is kind of weird because they do have two diacritics. They have a diacritic that means velarized, and they have a diacritic that means, pharyngealized. But this one is velarized or pharyngealized. It's kind of hard to tell what exactly is happening back there. So I think that's why people default to this. So this is why you might say lull, and it becomes sort of pulled back a little bit. That's one way to express that. I also like to use this wavy line diacritic with the R to explain, especially like an American Southern hard R, like a Texas red, real, velarized or pharyngealized. So that's a wavy line going through the middle of it. If you put the wavy line somewhere else, it actually changes it. There's a couple other diacritics that I'll talk about at another point. So I like to use that velarized or pharyngealized, especially with those two sounds. I think that they commonly explain a decent bit. I have two more that I want to go into, but I have to explain a third because it seems related to it. What most of us do, you would use the diacritic for this, which this is the diacritic for apical, meaning the apex. So you're going to the tip of your tongue, and most of the time when we say a T, we'll go, take your time, and it's apical. Now, what'll happen in a lot of accents, you might describe as this one, which is the diacritic for dentalized. So I'll tend to use this one, and this might be, take your time. Yo, what are you gonna do? Like in New York, take your time, what are you doing? And this would be like in Spanish, entonces, where you tend to move it onto the teeth. Now, I think most of the time when we're doing this, we are simultaneously doing another diacritic. So I wish you could do both at the same time, but you kind of can't tweak it twice. But anyway, the little square one, what that means is laminalized or laminal. What does that mean? It's the blade of the tongue. So instead of the tip of the tongue, apical, tip of the tongue, you kind of move it onto the blade, the duller part of the tongue. Don't. Take your time. Well, you're probably also moving it onto your teeth, so you may be doing both of those at the same time. This might be the TH sound. Things. Yo, those things. Or you could use it with a D as well. Either one of those underneath, not both, but either one of those to say, don't drink dairy, or for these becoming these. You could also potentially describe like this one as being moving to the blade, or maybe even dentalizing. This is the voiced TH. So this could be these. It depends on how you want to interpret it, what makes it clearer for you, or what makes it clearer for your audience, depending on who you're doing the transcribing for. So those are the primary ones that I like to use with consonants. So again, I like to use devoicing, say under that or under that especially. That's where I tend to use them the most. I also like to utilize the wavy line for the L or for the R, which is velarized or pharyngealized. I don't tend to use the voiced one, but I mentioned it a couple of times. Another one that I mentioned previously you could use to indicate the way that this is pulled back, which is that thumbtack, so it's that retracted tongue root. I talked about that within the context of the vowels. That's another way you might express this same idea. Depends on which of those diacritics you feel like best explains it. And then, as I mentioned, I don't tend to use apical because that's the way that it tends to be done, but I will use dentalized or laminalyzed. You could think of it as bladalized, moving to the blade of the tongue, or it's sort of dulling the sound in general. Those are the big ones that I tend to use for describing accents with regards to consonants. For more info on accents for actors, check out accenthelp.com.